more time. It's really great to have you here. We're going to be looking at how generative AI can be used in career guidance. What are the opportunities for personalization? What are the potential risks and the safeguards that are needed? So a big warm welcome to our speakers for today's session. We have Chris Percy, visiting research fellow at the University of Derby, and Sam Mitchell, who is an analyst working here at the OECD on AI in education. We're really pleased that both of you could join today, and I'm really excited to see what you say and have some discussion. Just some logistics before we begin. There will be time for question and answers at the end of the presentations. We invite you to write your questions in the chat. We will try to have that time for question and answer at the end. So all the way throughout, if you have questions, please do write them in the chat. You never know if somebody else might have a question that will be inspired by your question. We are recording this session, as I said. It will be available on YouTube. So if you turn your video on, you will be part of that. We do advise that you keep your video on off and mute yourself just to make sure that recording is clear. All of the recordings, the PowerPoint presentations will be available on the Career Readiness website, and we'll be putting that in the chat. So just to start, I want to share one small thing with you, and then I will hand over to Chris. So we did a little bit of some tests in the Career Readiness team of using ChatGPT to do some tasks. And I'll just share one of them. We asked ChatGPT quite a simple prompt saying, hi, I'm a 16-year-old secondary education in secondary education, thinking about becoming insert career here. What can you show me what I'd look like in 30 years? So the 4 different careers we chose was a scientist, a nurse, a teacher, and a data scientist. And this was what ChatGPT in its first iteration came out with. Maybe you can have a think about what you would expect ChatGPT to present. So here's a scientist. So looking very happy to be a scientist, which is interesting. I studied physics and chemistry. I'm not sure I saw many scientists that looked quite that happy, but here's a nurse, a teacher, and the data scientist. So I will leave up to you if having a look at that. But one thing that was interesting to me was there was that idea that scientists and data scientists are men, nurses and teachers are women, potentially a bias that we see in the labour market today. You'll also see a bit of lack of ethnicity representation. So that's interesting. You can also see that ChatGPT is really expanding the technology in all of these environments, except interestingly for the nurse. The nurse looks like she could be in a hospital today, whereas the others have screens that are invisible and things like that. Now, that's something very quick and interesting, at least for me, to see. But I'm going to hand over to the experts here. So, Chris, if you could start us off, that would be great.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much, Alison. And I sort of am nervous to admit this, but I will be introducing myself as a data scientist in a moment or two. So I will leave it to participants to judge how much I look like that particular person, maybe with a little bit more beard. But there are certainly data scientists who look far more different to me and to that person in that shot, however close I may or may not look. Alison, can you remind me how long I've got? Because I've got far too much information to share, and I do intend to be strict with myself.
About
How long do I have?
15 minutes would be great. 20 minutes if you're really pressed.
Perfect. Well, I will try to keep it within those. But what I will do is I'll tell you some of the other bits I've got at the end to talk about if I don't cover them. And then if the Q&A or discussion afterwards naturally goes that way, I would be delighted to share some of that extra information. So let me bring the slides up on screen and I'll introduce myself properly and then get into the material. So I think that's up on the screen. If I could just get a nod from Alison or from someone else.
Yep.
Yep, wonderful. So yeah, this session is specifically about generative AI, although when I first saw the title, it was AI in general. I will be focusing on generative AI, but I'll just give a couple of, at some point, I've got a list of other examples so we don't forget aspects of machine learning outside of generative AI. So I will touch on those. But let me first of all tell you a bit about who I am, so you know kind of why I'm here and the particular biases I'm likely to be coming with. So my background as a civil servant, I was a civil servant in the UK working on secondary education reform. I guess it would be about 18 or 19 years ago now. And I've done bits of time with charities and business. And I'm now sort of primarily a data scientist specializing in education and careers transitions and a couple of other areas. So that involves doing lots of research. I'm very interested in what improves labor market outcomes and some of the career readiness indicators that Anthony Mann spoke about in the previous session, and Alison as well, came from some research that I did for the UK and lots of other researchers for lots of other countries. But increasingly looking more and more at machine learning and at accountability within that space. You can't care about this without also being involved in policy. So I've been an expert witness for governments. I'm cited in various policy documents and get involved in the training and consultancy side as well. But in a way, the thing that kind of caused me to be invited to talk with you today is I'm also quite involved in kind of doing this stuff in as hands-on a way as I can. I'm not a trained careers professional, but I will do things like give volunteer feedback on CVs. I'll do mock interviews. I was a recruiting manager for many years. And I'm the co-founder of a careers chatbot, which I'll show you later on. It was briefly mentioned as one of the case studies earlier on called CC, but I will give you a few slides on that later on. So that's who I am, and hopefully that gives some context to what we're talking about. So generative AI, specifically in the context of career support, there is a lot at stake. This is an adjacent domain. This is the domain of therapy. An eating disorder helpline fired its staff, its sort of trained therapists, and moved to a chatbot. Within even just on the same sort of newsfeed that gave you that, I think within days they had to disable that chatbot because of harmful responses and indeed concern that someone died by suicide potentially as a result of talking with that chatbot. So there is a lot at stake. There is a lot at stake in getting this right. Lots of organizations are getting it wrong. And in the world of career guidance in particular, there is plenty of poor practice if you look for it, or indeed it may well be coming out to find you. So just a couple of examples. There was an example using a chatbot where you could choose the personality of a career counselor. Now, all that meant was literally someone telling the equivalent of ChatGPT, act like you are a career counselor and answer these questions. No input from the sector, no genuine expertise. And you can see from that list, no one organization is an expert in all those things. Yet they were promoting it as potentially doing career counselor type capabilities to get careers advice on jobs like higher studies. So these are just kind of off the shelf, very mildly prompted large language models being promoted to either generate material for websites or indeed to provide careers advice directly. And there are lots and lots of these if you look for them. I don't particularly mean to call these out, although I am, but there are many others. These are not the only two. So where is the sector? Where are practitioners? There are other more recent surveys out there, but I picked this one because it's one of the first I know about from late spring last year. And I'll show you one from late spring this year. This was practitioners. It was done on LinkedIn. Take it indicatively with a pinch of salt. What I want to draw out from this, these were careers practitioners, 80 odd responses. What I want to draw out is this huge variation between people that are using it every day. That's really quite intense level of usage, 12%, to those that have never used it, a quarter. This is last spring. Huge range in confidence, enormous desire to learn more. But really what I want to draw from this is that enormous variation in how much people are using it and their levels of confidence. And even a smaller survey, but nonetheless from spring this year, to draw out the same sort of thread. Many people have sort of used them, heard of them but not used them. And then there are some that are regularly using them for careers-related topics. Huge spread in terms of participation. So there is, no one is sort of, and there's still time in all of this. There's still time to get this right, and there's still time to get it wrong. So I'm going to be quite quick on what is this tech, because you saw a little bit from Alison in the intro. If you're in the earlier session, you heard some discussions about it. And I'm going to make an assumption that many of the people that are joining this type of session through this type of channel are already digitally savvy and have probably had some sort of a play with this. But Two big players in this space, OpenAI and Google. What do we mean by guidance? Well, this is things like, asking a fairly open-ended question or even just flagging an issue, and you would wait for the person to provide some feedback to that. Maybe you're under pressure about making a decision. And advice is a more specific question. It probably is a targeted question. It might be a closed question, and the person has got a particular topic in mind that they're looking for advice on. So we're talking about large language models potentially delivering advice or guidance. I'm reasonably skeptical about their ability to do much of those yet, but clearly the technology is moving fast. Just to give you a tiny feel for the domain, digital tools in career guidance, obviously nothing new at all. They've been around for decades and decades. In many ways pioneering the use of surveys in this kind of space, social research space. Language models pretending to be humans. First major example in 1966 with Eliza from MIT, which pretended to be a therapist and convinced quite a lot of its users. But really, the modern era probably began more like 2016 with the first sort of transformer type models coming out. They first became widely known to the public in November 22 when ChatGPT, I think it should be on here, yeah, OpenAI at the end of 2022 really opened the floodgates on this. And over the last year and a half, we've seen an enormous flood of things. Great deal of excitement in the career space, new jobs being created. You should be a prompt engineer so that you can work with these large language models. But particularly those jobs had in mind the early language models, maybe GPT-3. And this was ones where you really had to be quite clever to get these bots to do what you want. You can basically now just tell them what you want, and they'll, broadly speaking, have a pretty good go at it. Their test scores on standard tests have skyrocketed, and those jobs like prompt engineer, in a way, don't really apply to the current model. So there was maybe a brief window of time to be, a sort of a prompt engineer. Now you're either more of a general user or you're an absolute specialist designer. Those kind of mid-tier, you're like nearly a programmer, but not quite. Those have sort of changed, really, those sorts of roles. But it's still really, really, really early. Now, it's very easy to either get trapped in the hype or to give up on this. But I don't think the uptake will be the same as internet sales. But this just gives you a sense that even for something that from the context of today feels obvious and inevitable, it was well over a decade, 2 decades, for this to move from, an early usage of this was clearly several years before 2007. This is data for the UK. Adoption, adaptation, and exploitation take time. We are still early. These uptake curves are probably getting faster with every decade, but we are still early. There is still time for governments and the sector to get this stuff right. Right, I promised a few lists of ways that generative AI and other AI could help. Again, I'll just pick out a few examples from this. The slides are being shared. It's not just so in a way with those examples I gave right at the start, you might think, well, this is all about kind of the full Monty. You talk to a chatbot, pretend it's a person, pretend it's a careers advisor, and then you just get some output. But there's lots of other things these tools can do before they're good enough to do that. You can provide it with the CV and say, how do I make this better? You can try to solve the blank page problem, ask for a first draft of a cover letter. If you're a bad actor or a lazy actor, you might treat that as the final draft of a cover letter. Interview prep, career exploration, lots of things these things can do with lots of caveats. But in many ways, the kind of bad results you get, and you do get bad results when you try and do this, the challenge I would lay back to those accusations of bad results is, are they really any worse than doing just general Google searching? And truthfully, those are fairly low quality as well. Lots of other applications, things around gamification, personalized tutors, predictive models to help better identify course and career interests, application success rates. Most of these exist to an extent today. They'll probably be a lot better in 5 years' time. Screening, job coding, analyzing job adverts. I can talk, some of these I know better than others. We can definitely spend some time in Q&A on any one of those if you want. Another slide I'll go through quickly, but we can spend more time on it if we'd like to in the discussion. If you want to make a large language model today deliver advice and guidance, this is basically your option set at a high level. You can clearly just open one up and use it, and people are doing it today. I'll show a slide on that in just a second. You can do some basic prompt engineering. You can give it good examples, or you can start to kind of be more in the developer side of that. And those are things to the right there. And this is how it is being used today. This is very small UK higher education sample. So these are higher education careers advisors and higher education students, so likely to be digitally savvy. What sorts of things are already being done? This is by a half of students, almost a half of students are already using LLM technologies today for identifying careers that might suit them, job requirements, helping to draft things. Advisors well aware. Advisors certainly, I saw some of this in the chat earlier on, well aware that students are doing this sort of thing already. Interestingly, a third of students, again, caveating the sample, a third of students are using it for what we described in the question as longer term personalized guidance. Advisors who would consider themselves typically providing that thought that was vanishingly rare among any of their students. Meanwhile, you actually ask students directly, and a third of them are saying they're doing it. So, still early, but people are starting to use it in digitally savvy, probably more privileged, more digital access contexts. I'll skip this slide. So some concerns, lots of concerns, lots of concerns. You've heard about some of these before. I just want to pick out some of the things on the right-hand side. Clearly, if you want to be a bad actor, there's loads of bad things you can do. We're aware of those risks to some extent. But even if you try to do this with the sector supporting it, you've still got worries over kind of overconfidence, transparency. Will the bot know when it should tell you to seek professional help? Will it know what it doesn't know? At the moment, the bots are fairly repetitive, quite dull. They tend not to challenge the user. They tend not to be up to date. You can do things to fix those to some extent. Probably a few years from now, a lot of these limitations will be significantly improved upon. But the point I want to highlight here, and this is really in a sense of humility, even when you're doing sector-led development, as the organization that I'm a co-founder on is doing, you've still got all of these things that can go wrong, and we are sort of deeply aware of that. Does this stuff only really work for digital savvy and critical thinking experts already? In which case, is the solution ban the AI, or is the solution to get education working as it should be and get people up to those levels of digital savviness and critical thinkingness? Who is responsible in a sense for this? And I sense probably the crude, unhelpful answer is everyone has some degree of responsibility in this, but we shouldn't be ignoring responsibility on getting people ready to use tools, even with some of the limitations they're likely to have. Bear in mind, people are already using online searches. Online searches have most of these flaws already. So here's an example of how we're doing it. It's UK tailored. You could develop it for other markets. We're definitely open to suggestions from partners in other countries that might want to collaborate with us in building a version tailored to other chatbots. Our general approach has been to move kind of slowly and with the sector. So we've worked with careers professionals from the start, and we've been doing this for 3 or 4 years, and we tend to be quite cautious about how this can work. At the same time, we see all the other bad practice out there that's motoring ahead. So there's a limit to how slowly we can move. The heart of what this chatbot does is not actually large language model powered. The heart of it is data. And that's why it's tailored to the UK. We don't have this data for every country. It's tailored to specific jobs, specific courses, and I guess videos that were recorded in a UK context. A few examples of what it looks like. So graphs, click and play, you can ask questions. It's the way we advise it is that it's always integrated into a service that's got careers advisors available, and then it can provide a record of the user journey to those careers advisors. Right, that's enough of that. That's given you a bit of a feel for it. You can kind of see dashboards, obviously, when people are using it, what professions they're interested in. And I think I will stop here. According to my timer, I'm at 15.5 minutes. So that feels about right. I'd be delighted to come back to any of those topics I moved through more quickly, or this very specific topic around how could we evaluate bots a bit like CC, or indeed other ones or other tools a bit like this. We've done some surveys with the sector and we did a series of workshops last summer to develop some options around this. So that is something I can come back to if you want. But for now, I will stop and we'll move on to the next.
Great. Thanks, Chris. That was very well timed. So 15 minutes, love it. We're going to move over to Sam. I do think that idea of developing trust and effectiveness is something that we might be interested in. I would encourage, if you're in the chat, do ask questions. It's fine if you have different level of experience with AI, so there's no such thing as a bad question. So please do ask those questions in the chat. We'll be looking at them. But I'll hand over to Sam now, who's going to give us a bit of a perspective from his work. Sam.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I'd just like to thank Alison and her team for organising this session. I'm also from the same team as Margarita. I'm an analyst here in the AI and Future of Skills team. I'd also like to just briefly respond to Chris's presentation. I thought that was a really interesting example of a tool being developed in this space and sort of a very reflective consideration of both the positives and the negatives that come with the development of any AI tool in any space. And part of what I want to speak about today is really the impact that AI is going to have, not just on the specific how career guidance takes place, but really on the content of what's going to happen with careers. You know, what sort of impact is AI going to have on the things that career guidance practitioners have to give advice on, have to talk to their students, maybe people outside of school that they're advising, so that they can find a career that suits for them. And also, you know, maybe that's not one career, particularly in a sort of AI world. I imagine that things are going to move very quickly. I can speak a little bit about some of the challenges surrounding bias and equity that have been raised, perhaps in the Q&A, but I'm going to focus my remarks, as I said, on this why question, how skill demand's going to change, and sort of the role that we see our team here at the OECD playing in working that out. So first of all, as you saw, both actually Chris showed some examples of this, but Margarita also showed some tests that we've done on ChatGPT-4 and ChatGPT-4 multimodal's performance on PISA questions. It's very clear that skill demand in the next 5 to 10 years, or even right now, is already changing. And this is going to change in all sorts of different ways. Skill demand is going to change for existing jobs. You might find that, for example, for a career guidance counselor, that because of tools like CC, actually the human in the loop, as we call it, doesn't need to have as much specific knowledge of training schemes and educational programs. You know, AI is going to be able to plug that gap. It has an awful lot of information in its memory that it's able to recall very quickly at a superhuman level. And then we might find that actually within the career of career guidance counseling, that the human role, that this emphasis on social emotional skills becomes much more significant. And you know, actually, I think Chris sort of pointed to some of the weaknesses of AI. I saw on one of the slides, you know, this problem that basically AI it can be sort of overly enthusiastic about things and can't ask the sort of difficult, critical questions that come with careful career advice. And actually, you know, this kind of development of even further development of skills amongst career guidance professionals is perhaps something that AI is going to enable. And then you have the kind of human AI symbiosis producing hopefully higher outcomes. It's also the case that some careers that exist right now will exist potentially not at all in 5 or 10 years, or will exist at a much reduced rate. You know, one example that we've seen already take place over the past 3 or 4 years, even before the advent of large language models, was companies replacing huge sections or even total departments of their call center operations with automated tools. And you know, one thing that you already see happening in a particularly large industry, particularly in developed countries, software development, is that there's huge job cuts that are being justified on the basis that a lot of this work can be automated with AI. Now, that doesn't mean that people are being replaced wholesale by AI, or that certain job types are being removed from the market completely. But what it does mean, particularly in sectors like coding, where large amounts of it can be automated with human oversight, is that you have a situation where 4 or 5 people can do the same amount of work or even more work than 10 people were able to do 2 or 3 years ago. And then again, this leads to questions about, okay, well, what sort of skills is this shift going to lead to? Are people going to need more management skills, more interpersonal skills, versus just having knowledge of raw coding? So just to give you some statistics on this, according to Investopedia, 42,500 tech jobs were cut just in the first quarter in 2024 in the US and European countries. And it should be said as a sort of caveat to this that actually this industry's been seeing major layoffs since the pandemic. It's very easy for bosses to turn around and say, oh, we're doing this because we're focusing on AI. Sort of shareholders love this. They think it means the company is going to sort of increase its productivity and value over time. But with all those caveats in place, it's still the case that we're already seeing relatively major shifts as a result of the current developments in AI, let alone, as Chris said, sort of you look at these problems now, and once those are ironed out in 5 or 10 years, which it seems most of them probably will be, that these impacts are going to be even more fundamental. A final thing on this impact on careers is, again, something Chris mentioned, but I'd just like to expand on a little bit, is that new careers will emerge. Now, this isn't this kind of overly technocratic optimism that okay, there's however many jobs that are going to be destroyed by AI or significantly reduced, there's going to be this huge explosion in new careers. The simple fact is we don't know. We know there's going to be labor market disruption. We know that with previous technological innovations that disruption early on has led to sort of an overall increase in the number of positions and productivity overall within the economy. But we can sit here and say that actually we know that we're heading into stormy seas, and that it might well lead to a sort of better place in the long term, but there's going to be a lot of disruption in the short term. And this is something that, as a career advisor, it's very important to be able to identify skills that are going to be robust versus those skills that, maybe even are a passing fad, but are very hyped at the moment. So, for example, I saw on Chris's slideshow this job posting for a legal prompt engineer. Now that this is, that there's not been sort of much quantitative work on this at the moment, but this is a job type where I believe the postings in the past few months have actually been decreasing, as it's become clear that sort of more and more cutting edge, powerful models need less of this prompt engineering than was the case 1 or 2 years ago. So, this thing that sort of 12 months ago, everyone was saying, oh, if you're interested in AI, you need to go and do a prompt engineering course. We're going to pay $200,000 to someone that's got this prompt engineering skill. All of a sudden, it actually looks like that's not a very robust skill. And this is something that, if you're a careers advisor, you would have done very well to have said a year or two ago, okay, this skill may or may not be important, but here are some more robust skills that you have that might be suitable to develop in searching for your career. So the question is then, well, how do we put career guidance counselors in a place where they can make these sort of judgments in an informed way? There's been a lot of AI policy that's been very well publicized. Most of this is around governance and security. But so far, most of this AI policy is going forward without really a detailed understanding of what AI can and cannot do, what we in our team call AI capabilities. And so part of our project, I think Margarita gave a little bit of an insight into this, but just to sort of expand on that, is to build AI measures of AI capabilities. What are things that we traditionally consider capabilities that humans need for particular jobs, and how can we say in a way that's understandable for policymakers, practitioners, students, the public at large, the sorts of skills that AI can and can't do, and then identify the areas of the job market where it's likely, because AI has those abilities, that there's going to be a large impact. So we're working with a team of experts, computer scientists, and then we will then at a later point coordinate that work with labor market analysts, so that we can concretely say that AI has the capability to do analogical reasoning, for example, or as you see with ChatGPT, AI has linguistic ability that many people thought was not possible for AI to have 4 or 5 years ago. Many people that worked on human language thought that large language models, just by having this very simple algorithm of next word prediction, would never reach human levels of fluency. And we see now, it's dangerous. They're too fluent. They say things that may or may not be true, but they say them in such a convincing way that many people believe them. And so there are some very highly publicized examples of this, such as ChatGPT, where people sort of have an innate sense that, okay, it's very good at language. But then there's other capabilities important in the workforce that actually we have next to no information on. And the goal of our project is to be able to give indicators to people so that they can make those sorts of decisions. And I think that's particularly important for career guidance for the points I mentioned above. If you had a sort of clear understanding of the sorts of capabilities that are going to be what you might call robust to AI, and you have the understanding that actually, okay, AI is not so great at reasoning now, it's not very good at thinking of things outside of context, but it will probably be good at those things in 4 or 5 years. Well, those are the two capabilities that prompt engineers bring to AI. And so you could have been in a space, or you working with an AI tool like CC could have been in a space to say, well, okay, maybe prompt engineering isn't as robust as these other professions that you, the user of this service, have particular skills in and should develop to go forward in your career. I think I do have a few more remarks sort of that speak to wider questions that were brought up in the course of this discussion, and some that were also brought up in Chris's presentation, but those aren't directly related to what I've just said. So I'll leave it there, and I'd be happy to sort of either comment on other things or return to sort of what I've said about how we see careers being impacted, and really how we're trying to develop tools for this space where at the moment it's very challenging for people to make policy.
Great. Thank you, Sam. That was really interesting. And I think it's something that when we're talking about AI tools, we need to be thinking about the tools themselves, but we also need to be thinking about the impact that it has on society, and the changes to labour market is something that is on a lot of people's minds. So we have a few questions. Some of them might be that we need to go a little bit more into depth about some of those things that you mentioned at the end there, Chris. But let me start with Lue Sim has asked from CC in particular, Chris, what can we learn from in terms of its adoption, its engagement, like usage patterns? Are students using them potentially CC at night or during school? And then the outcomes for career planning. So what have we learnt and that maybe could be used in other applications?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. There's definitely, a few things I would pull out. One is that organizations, so the kind of the budget holders, the careers advisors, the leadership teams in schools, colleges, and universities, at least in the UK, are, I think, rightly pretty cautious about this. So obviously some people are buying it. That's, there is a service available, people are using it, but people are cautious. They tend to want to see lots of demos. Often they want to switch off the large language model component of CC. So as I sort of briefly said in the demo, the core of it isn't really a large language model. It was built without that, but we've obviously incorporated that because that's where the tech is. I think over half of our education clients have preferred not to use that at this stage. So the process tends to be slow, cautious, and erring towards kind of not including the functionality that we're talking about most, and in a sense, most where the risks are greatest. The benefits might be greatest as well, but definitely that's where the risks are greatest. So that's one thing I would say, kind of cautiousness among the from the organization side, the purchasing side. From the student side, on the other hand, we have the opposite effect, which is an assumption that it will be able to do all of these things already. And you see this actually. I mean, those of us that spent much time frontline in education will know this already, just from playing computer games or seeing TV, the expectations from students around how engaging media should be, how interactive it should be, how clever it should be is just sort of unattainable, really, for much of us working in this space. And that general feature of ed tech absolutely plays across into the careers tech and the chatbot. So we will occasionally sort of see comments, or when we directly speak to users, get feedback a bit like, why can't I just ask it anything? We block off lots of questions that aren't relevant. Why can't I just talk to it like a person? Or why isn't it as good as XYZ? The reason, so interestingly, it is powered by OpenAI. We've had comments saying, why isn't it as good as ChatGPT? And I thought, well, it's the same tech, but we've deliberately stopped it from doing some stuff that we're worried about. So that's the tension. You've got this strong tension between expectations on the one side, and then I think sensible kind of caution, both on us as developers, but also on a procurement side. Alison briefly mentioned usage times. So this is absolutely strong. We see probably the heaviest usage at the end of the school day or in the early evenings. There's even a tiny bit in the early mornings, but mostly it's kind of later evenings, early evenings. So there's definitely opening up space for when people are thinking about these questions that they wouldn't typically have access to people as well. I think those are some top of mind thoughts. Let me pause there so we can do more of the other questions as well.
Yeah, sure. Really helpful thoughts. And that idea of the difference, the data you talked about, the difference of what students are saying they're doing and what the teachers think the students are doing, I think is really, really interesting. And something I think that we need to remember happens with a lot of technology change. The uptake of technology in general is done by younger people much more quickly than it is by older people, maybe because, when they're not thinking so much about governance and risk. And that's something that we can definitely be thinking about. Now, Sam, there has been a message here talking about indicators. So indicators that are key for practitioners. So you talked a little bit about your work in figuring out what AI competencies can be. And as these indicators are changing, is there anything that you are predicting people need to be thinking about, need to be aware about? What are some things on the horizon of this technology change in AI? Might be a difficult question, so because I know it's going very quickly and it might be difficult to predict, but maybe from your work, I was quite surprised to see in Margarita's presentation how quickly the AI was able to complete some of the tasks.
Yeah, so there's a few things to speak to there. The first thing I'm going to do is engage in really flagrant self-promotion, which I can only apologize for before I do so. So there are a lot of claims out there that AI is going to come in and replace like 30% of jobs by 2030, et cetera, et cetera. I can't claim to have sort of read every single publication of this type. But genuinely, these work on a very high level. So take, for example, ChatGPT. Okay, ChatGPT can replicate human language pretty well. And then they'll do something like they'll go on a sort of jobs resource like ONET and say, okay, well, how many of all of these jobs have a task in them that requires language? And then 30% of jobs will say, okay, you need to be able to speak to someone on the phone, and go, okay, ChatGPT can do that. Great, that job's replaced. When in actual fact, human jobs are a lot more complex than that. And another thing that we find that is very interesting is that actually what we consider lower skilled jobs, because they have so many things that we just take for granted with human beings, such as the ability to move your body in all sorts of different ways, the fact that your wrist can twist, etc. All these things that we take for advantage are actually some of the hardest things for AI. And indicators scarcely actually take these common sense assumptions into consideration. If AI can just sort of replicate the reading and writing skills that someone's required for their job, they'll say, okay, well, that whole job can be automated, and that's not automated, and that's not the case. And what we're doing on my team in developing our indicators, and I hate to sit here and be in a position where I have to say, look out in 5 or 6 months' time, but over a process of 2 or 3 years, and we sort of did some pre-trials on this as well. We've been working with computer science experts to sort of draw a pattern of trends at the cutting edge of the field so that we can create indicators that actually take a much more detailed look at all of the capabilities, no matter how common sense, no matter how complex in sort of human job tasks, so that we can come up with an analysis that actually gets to those key details. And, it's not going to be perfect. We're going to make loads of mistakes. But we think that they're going to be much smaller mistakes and sort of much closer to the general trend as it develops than competing studies have been so far. And another really great advantage of this approach with sort of working with computer science scientists at the sort of cutting edge of the field is that we think we'll be pretty sensitive to big changes, what I call ChatGPT shock moments. As Chris showed on that kind of timeline, actually this stuff outside of the public eye had been in the pipeline for a long time. And a lot of computer scientists could have said to you when in 2017, this transformer paper came out, it led to this huge explosion in technology, large language models. And actually someone could have said, yeah, in 3 or 4 years time, we're going to have these models that are really going to start to be touching on human levels and exceeding human levels at very critical tasks, reading, writing, science comprehension, like we saw in PISA. But in November 2020, this rushed onto the scene, and suddenly it was all everyone was talking about. And there's probably going to be moments like that in the future. And what we hope with our indicators is, rather than just sort of giving people ballpark figures, we can sort of give people an insight into, okay, if there is a shock in this area, let's say that there's a huge step forward in robotics technology, and suddenly all of these aspects of manual labor that are so hard at the moment for AI suddenly become possible. Well, how do we respond to that? How's that going to impact careers? Which parts of sort of human body movement and manual labor are still going to be human only? Which parts of AI are going to start to come into? And that's what we really hope for with our indicators, which we hope to have published in an initial form at the beginning of 2025. So please watch out for those. I think there are a couple of other aspects to that question, but I've already taken a lot of time, so I'll pass over back to Alison.
No, thank you so much. And yeah, I really would encourage you, and this is not, this is a plug without any shame, do look out for those indicators. I know the team that Sam and Margarita are working really hard to make sure that this is helpful, particularly when we're looking in the youth aspect, because I do think that understanding development is important when we're also understanding AI. Okay, we have about 15 minutes left, which is great. What I'd like to talk, there's a couple of questions in the chat. Carolina's asking about environmental impacts. Loni is talking about democratization. I wonder maybe if we could speak quickly to some of the issues that AI presents, and you can choose. I know there's quite a few, but so environmental, democratization. For me, a little bit of bias is also something that I think we need to be thinking about, particularly when we're in a guidance context. How do we actually deal with that issue? Is it an issue, or are there ways that we can go about using AI in a helpful way? Chris, maybe that you want to start off, and then you can hand over to Sam when you're ready.
Yeah. I mean, certainly huge topics, but I can share at least one thought on most of them. So yeah, on the energy point, yeah, I mean, as of right now, the energy usage on this is pretty small compared to total global energy usage. But you can imagine a world in which everyone has tailored, fine-tuned AIs for a dozen different tasks, following them around all day, and then at that point it does become quite concerning. I think my policy view on that would be you don't reduce energy use by targeting specific uses of energy. You go upstream to the cost of energy and the production of energy in the first place. So rather than saying, oh, don't worry, you can you use as much electricity as you want for domestic purposes in your home, but you're not allowed to use AI on your computer, or you're allowed to use it for Zoom, but you're not allowed to use it for ChatGPT. That kind of micromanagement seems unlikely to be effective. Clearly, there are major energy issues in the world, but I would place the policy solutions far more upstream at the level of energy quotas or taxes or caps, that sort of thing. You sort of go upstream rather than downstream. The point about democratization is really interesting because in a sense, compared to some other technologies, because of the way there's been surge of open source AI tools, in a way, bits of it are are much more, and in a way, even the costs, $20 a month is much lower than the costs of, which brought enormous socioeconomic locational freedom and flexibility to people. When those were first introduced, they were far more financially exclusive than this, orders of magnitude more exclusive. And over time, in many countries, there's now kind of access to transport, whether it's public or private, in various forms. So the democratizing one is interesting. The impacts on democracy, I'm probably more concerned about, in terms of bias, Alison's point there, and polluting the information commons, and those sorts of concerns, and the ability to power misinformation campaigns and influence campaigns, which are nothing new. Been around for literally centuries, misinformation campaigns, probably millennia. I'm sure we could find it back in some old Chinese texts or some Roman texts. So misinformation through text is nothing new, but it being massively powered and more accessible in a way that democratizes the ability to do misinformation. Is that good or bad? So I'm probably more worried about that usage in a way, rather than democratic access to the tech, because in a weird way we have worse issues of democracy of access elsewhere, and much of it gets caught up in broader democracy of access to digital tech, electricity, and compute more generally. But that I would happily wrap up in terms of broader socioeconomic inequalities. I don't think there's a specific AI point in there. It's a more broader. Do you have your own computer? Do you have a smartphone? That sort of thing.
Great, thank you. Really interesting. And I also, I suppose one thing I was thinking there is that idea of the bigger issue. So sometimes when we're focusing on just one small thing, we forget some of those bigger flows. So the idea of like actual digital competencies and building those in students is probably something that we need to be focusing on, rather than saying let's not use it because students don't know how to use it, or there's risks. All right, Sam, any ideas in terms of some of these issues, these bigger, broader issues with AI?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to repeat what Chris said, that many of these problems are kind of old problems that just have a new sheen on them because AI is the sort of order of the day, which doesn't mean that they're not problems, and it doesn't mean that sort of AI brings its own particular flavor to them. But I agree. I think the solutions at a sort of higher and wider societal level. I would like to make a couple of interesting points about bias. I want to make an interesting point about democratization and access to technologies, and then I want to make an interesting point about bias. So the first one is actually the impact that these technologies can have on children and people with disabilities. There's actually this really great publication from the OECD, not my team this time, so I'm plugging someone else's work, which was published at the end of last year, which is called Using AI to Support People with Disability in the Labour Market. And this goes over a number of different technological solutions for various forms of disability, and actually the sort of transformational role that AI can play in giving people that previously had no access to educational resources, certain forms of work, that actually these options are now available. And so I think that's really great. That's like a really, this is my really like kind of AI positive. This is like a really nice thing it can do. There are huge issues in that space. One of them is investment. Often these solutions that could give people huge benefits are very expensive, and often sort of various populations of people with disabilities aren't sort of large enough to be an interesting market. And there's some interesting considerations in that publication. But I just think it's a really inspiring example of the sort of positive impact this technology can have, although it still has sort of the same downsides and concerns that are brought up in a wider context. On bias as well, I just wanted to give a really interesting example going back to Alison's opening presentation in the opening session about bias in AI, and particularly with image generation. I mean, image generation, for whatever reason, it's not my sort of particular specialty, but it really has this problem with bias. And attempts to fix it haven't gone very well. And I think it's sort of important to be aware that, as I think Margarita said earlier, that it's quite a complex problem. I think there's reasons to think that it will be able to overcome it with AI, but it's not a simple quick fix. So some of you may have seen this, that Google released a AI image generator earlier in the year, which basically sort of came with the claim that it was able to overcome these biases in image generation. It would give you a wide array of people from all the sorts of different backgrounds that work in data science, from all sorts of different backgrounds that work in nursing, as teachers, men, women, LGBTQ, people from all sorts of different races and ethnic backgrounds, etc. And of course, the issue with this was that it had sort of been hard coded in at the end. And so when one famous example was when people sort of asked Google to produce images of German soldiers during World War II, suddenly you had all these images of African Americans, people that seemed like they came from a Jewish background, or LGBTQ people, and you had this with all sorts of different historical problems. Now, I don't think you can sort of criticize Google for trying, and I don't think they foresaw that this was going to be a consequence of what they were trying to do here. But it does show that, there's still a lot that researchers and computer scientists have to learn about the way these models work. And that I do have confidence that will come. There are reasons to think it's going to be very difficult, but bias is going to be a problem in this space. People are going to come up with fixes for it. Some of them may work quite well. Some of them may work quite badly. But I think we need to sort of have a healthy skepticism. I think, as Alison was saying in the first session, where we need to sort of think, okay, how are we going to evaluate the outcomes of this objectively? And when AI systems say that, okay, we're controlling for bias, we need mechanisms that we can actually use to test that and test those claims.
Yeah, really interesting, and thank you for your very reasonable response. I think that something that we need to remember is that bias is in a lot of systems, including non-AI systems. So it is in our society. And so it's something that AI may potentially amplify or potentially highlight for us, but it isn't just an AI problem. Now I'm going to go until about 12:20 just because we had a few issues at the start. I hope that's okay. There's a few more questions coming through, but I think that it would be great. Chris, do you think you could do 5 minutes on that building trust and using AI in a helpful way? Because I think that could be quite helpful for people that are considering either studying AI, understanding some of the opportunities and challenges there.
Yes, happy to. Yeah, let me pull those up. And yeah, if nothing else, because with the slides being shared, this will at least give you an idea of what's in those slides so that you can decide if you want to dig them out later on. So yeah, I'll do just a couple of minutes showing you this. On the screen, there it is, I think. Lovely. So, this came out of a series of 3 workshops we did with policymakers, some technical folk, careers guidance practitioners, and various others kind of in and around the sector last summer. And kind of 5 broad ideas. And there's nothing new in these ideas. You'll see a survey view on which ones were most popular in a moment, but it's helpful to get a sense of what the range is. So this could be for any AI bot, but we were thinking of a language model powered one, even if it's not exclusively that. You can just have people have a play with it. They play with it and they give some view. You can either do that formally or informally. I'll give an example of how it could be done more formally in a moment. Then there's a field trial, either with actual users or with people that you recruit specifically for it. Or you could design a benchmark and then see if it's exceeded. In a lot of the AI space, there's lots of talk about benchmarks because this is what was being used 10, 20, 30 years ago when no one was getting near any of the benchmarks. But there were lots and lots of benchmarks for things like, if you show it a picture, does it know whether the red rabbit is on the left or the right of the yellow box? Various questions about logic, dozens and dozens of these benchmarks. So they're very familiar in the world of AI, but I've not seen any formal benchmarks for career guidance. So they would need to be built from scratch. And then there's a sector kite mark, which would probably be built off some combination of the others. Just to jump to kind of my personal view or the CC view is that you probably want a mixture of these. And at some point, you need proper, institutionally funded research to do this at scale. Up until then, or even once you've got that, there's no harm in doing some internal testing. But really, at some point, you want this to be done properly. So internal stuff, obviously, you can just play around with it. And this is accessible to any organization of any scale. You just start adding a bit of structure, and that means you'll get better results. So which staff? Let's specify the type of staff we want. What are their backgrounds? What do they know? Maybe we require the staff to do some specific scenarios, or at least to spend a minimum amount of time on it. So we're just trying to move from informal to formal, give them some idea of what to score the bot against, maybe involve some people outside the organization. So even with these, low cost, internally driven, organization driven, you could do this as a secondary school very easily with a little bit of passion. Introduce those things to make it a bit more formal. A field trial, also accessible to individuals, schools, colleges, universities, and employability providers, but takes a bit, it's a bit trickier if you want to make it blinded. But you need to think about what are you comparing against? Are you doing a comparison trial, or just a single usage trial where you basically just get feedback on how someone used it, were they satisfied with it, and so on. But you can start to think a bit in advance about who is it, number of users, what are you collecting, and so on. And obviously, this is the kind of thing where doing it properly is in the orders of probably hundreds of thousands of, dollars, euros, take your pick. And that's where you want some sort of a blinded design and proper scale. But even doing this, we did one of these just sort of driven with, with passion and goodwill, and you can go some way with that as well. The benchmark one, I think, is really interesting because this is, as I say, this is how the AI sector naturally operates. Although we're moving into red teaming now, we're being a bit more interactive and thoughtful over testing a bot. But broadly speaking, you literally give the bot an exam. So you need to write the exam. You need to decide what is a career guidance question and what does a good answer look like. Maybe it's a real life scenario and you iterate it over several questions. Maybe rather than an exam, you have an actor to do it. This is very common in the medical profession. Before doctors or therapists are let loose on people with actual real life medical issues, they work with actors pretending to have those issues. And they work in a very structured way with a very structured rubric for how to market. Well, we could do that. We could do this for career guidance. We've not done it. Bluntly, we don't have the budget, but we would love to see this kind of work being done, and we'd be very supportive of participating in it. We will probably bid for this kind of research funding ourselves. Lots of things to worry about to get it done right, but there's probably something a bit like this that we can do. Let's just repeat. So we asked the same, small convenient sample of higher education folk in the UK, what sort of evaluation would you like to see? Well, the advisors, the careers advisors, they all wanted everything. Fair enough. They were most interested in a panel of professional careers advisors. Fair enough. The students were a bit of a mixture. No one standout, maybe slight preference for careers advisors, but nothing really stood out. At least 90% of the students picked at least one of these, just to give you some feel for it. So only really 10% were saying, oh, I don't know, or none of these are good enough, or I would hate it anyway. And there were students who would say, I would have no confidence in the LLM technology, no matter how you evaluate it. I have a moral or a technologically founded objection to it. And that's just to give you a thought for evaluating these things.
Thank you, Chris. That was very interesting and I think really helpful. A lot of questions are talking about, that lazy user that you mentioned and how to motivate them. We are running out of time. We've got to the very end. We are moving into a lunch break. So it's an hour and 15 minutes. This next session that you'll join us is the Career Digital Fair, where CC is actually going to be there. So if you want to see CC in action, I really do recommend that you come along. There'll be about 8 different presentations, and then we'll have time to ask questions. But a lot of people in the chat are saying this has been a really interesting session, so much food for thought. I think when we set it up, we realized it was a big topic. So thank you, Chris, and thank you, Sam, for your thoughtful and helpful way of distilling this information to us. For those of you in this particular breakout room, thank you so much for joining us, for your enthusiasm, for your questions. It seems like this is something that we're really interested in, so it is something that we'll continue to be exploring. So keep an eye out for the work of Sam's team early 2025. Keep an eye out on CC and what's going on, and Chris's work, and also have a look on Odyssey for more and more, I hope, examples of AI being used in career guidance, and see how they're being used. But thank you, everybody, and we'll go back to that main room. If you log out for whatever reason, you can just log back into the same Zoom link, but at the moment you can leave the room and that'll head us back to that main room. So thank you very much.